I get asked this question quite a bit. What gauge metal should I use to make a ring? Well, it sounds like it should have a simple answer, but it doesn't. A 16 gauge shank might be appropriate in one design, but be too heavy or too thin for another design. So you really should be asking, what gauge do I want the finished ring to be? Because you have to take into consideration your filing, your sanding, your polishing, which also removes metal. So let's go to the bench and let's talk about it. Let's look at a few different examples. Here's a ring with a very wide shank. On the surface, it looks kind of thin. If we actually measure it, we have a width of a little bit over 10 millimeters in width. So that's a pretty hefty ring in width, that is. If we measure the thickness of the shank, we get roughly 2 point, I don't know, it's actually under 2. It's 1.8 or so. Now let's take a look at this ring. This is much more delicate. It has a bezel setting that's pretty low set. There's a few stones that are set into the band. And the width of this ring shank is just over 2, so 2.18 or so. So it's fairly wide, or fairly thin, I should say. And the thickness is just over 1.5, a little bit more than 1.5. It looks much more delicate than this ring does. The stone size is the same. The settings of the additional stones into the shank is the same, or roughly similar, but they have two very different aesthetics. Now let's compare a single band with just some hammered texture, and at first glance it looks a little bit wider than this amethyst ring that has a little bit more delicate feel, and it also looks much thicker than the band on the amethyst. So let's measure that one as well. The width on this one is 3.6 or so. It's fairly wide. And the thickness is just over 2 millimeters. It's like 2.02. It's thick enough to be worn as an everyday ring. There are two measurements that students often get mixed up. That is the width of the band, meaning across how it's going to sit on the finger, and then the thickness of the band, and that's the difference between the inside of the shank and the outside of the shank. Both of those can be very significant, and if you're not careful of how you measure them or how you decide to place them in your design, it can make the ring look heavy or it can make it look too light. And depending on the use of the ring or the wear of the ring, it might be too heavy or it might be too light. So let's look at them side by side. See if I can get all three of them on my finger. So you have a narrow shank with the amethyst here with a few set stones. You have a textured band that's just plain, and then you have more of a statement type that's a lot wider, and as we can tell from the measurements earlier, it's a little bit thinner. So when you really think about it, gauge is just a convenient way of describing the thickness and the width of the metal that you can buy. It's not necessarily what you're going to base your entire design decision on. So a 6 millimeter width sheet used for a ring is going to be very different structurally from a 2 millimeter width shank. That 2 millimeter width shank might come from a heavier stock, meaning the thickness might not be 20 gauge, maybe it's actually a 14 gauge or a 2 millimeter thickness. So it's really important to understand the difference between width and thickness. Width is going to give you visual mass, and thickness is going to give you structural integrity. Let's take a look at two different pieces of potential ring stock. You have sheet, which is usually wider and thinner, and then you have wire stock, which is usually narrower and thicker. So in this case, the sheet metal is roughly 15 millimeters across, almost 16 millimeters. Actually, it's closer to 18 millimeters across. But the thickness is less than 1 millimeter. It's 0.8, which roughly translates into 20 gauge. So this would be potentially appropriate for your design if you're looking for a wider band structure with less mass. And that also is going to depend on your ultimate intention for that ring. Now let's take a look at the wire stock. Visually, it's very different from the sheet, obviously, right? So if I take my calipers and measure this one, I get a width of roughly 2.42 or 3. So almost 2.5 millimeters across with a thickness of 1.72. 1.72. So this ring stock is going to be significantly different than the sheet ring stock. You can see very, very different. There's the thickness of the wire stock versus the sheet stock. So instead of thinking of raw stock material, start thinking in terms of the final design. How thick do I want it? How wide do I want it? Professional jewelers typically will measure their metals in millimeters because every little dimensional change matters. If you were to go to a retail store and break out your calipers and start measuring rings in their cabinets, you would find that the average thickness of a retail ring is about 1.5 to 1.7 millimeters. And that's just a professional standard. Doesn't mean that your ring needs to be that thickness or that width. It's just what the overall jewelry industry uses. Use that professional benchmark as a starting point to evaluate your design choices. It's not about what gauge to buy yet, but instead, how do I want the finished product to look? Remember, finishing removes metal. It may be minute, but sanding, polishing, texturing, all of those things will remove metal from your ring shank. The 5 questions I ask before buying stock, and this is an internal question. 1, how will the ring be worn? Is it an everyday ring like a wedding band? Or is it a thin, delicate ring that's stacked up against others? Or is it a once in a while statement ring that the person will wear on special occasions? So a wide band versus a narrow band. In a narrow band, you risk the potential for distortion, meaning twisting, bending, even breaking or wearing through. With a wider band, those things are less likely to happen because the structural integrity is different. The third question is, what am I going to ask this ring shank to support? Meaning, am I going to put a bezel setting on top? Will I use a prong setting? Or is my plan just to flush set stones? And depending on what I build on top of the shank, I might need something with a little bit more substantial weight behind it in the shank in order to support the stone. Keep in mind, the heavier and the higher the structure on top of the ring shank, the more substantial the ring shank needs to be. The fourth question is, what metal am I going to use? Will it be sterling silver? Will it be gold? And if it's gold, is it 14 karat, 18 karat, 10 karat? Every metal alloy behaves differently. They have different structural integrities and they have different strengths and weaknesses. So you have to evaluate that as well. Just because the 14 karat yellow gold is the same thickness as the 14 karat, the 14 karat, the 9.25 sterling silver doesn't necessarily mean they're going to support the same structure on the top. And the last question, question number 5, is how much of this metal am I going to remove in the process of fabricating this ring? Also, you want to think about sanding. Unfortunately, a lot of beginners start off with a ring stock that is in the dimension of their final design choice. So my advice is give yourself enough metal to make the ring well. Think about all of those design aesthetics that you're planning before you choose the stock that you're going to use. So to support these comments and claims, I've created a downloadable worksheet that's available on my bench in the resources. If you're not a member of my bench, you can join for free. So let's talk about some practical starting ranges. 16 gauge is about 1.2 millimeters in thickness. And that will work really well for more delicate rings that are maybe layered and stackable with others. It's a good starting point. 14 gauge is roughly 1.63, a little bit over 1.5 millimeters. And this is a little bit more substantial and could withstand a little bit more activity in daily wear. It's still very delicate and will need some extra care, but it's the next level in thickness for a thinner, narrower band. 13 to 12 gauge is the next level of thickness, meaning bigger. It's roughly about 1.8 to 2.05 millimeters in thickness. This is more substantial, can withstand a lot more everyday type wear, could also substantiate having a basket setting or a prong setting or a bezel setting on the top. So the ring shank could support a little bit more design aesthetic on the top of it or a setting. 11 gauge to 10 gauge would be the next level in thickness, and that's anywhere between 2.3 and 2.5 millimeters in thickness. This is very substantial and can be used for statement rings and definitely everyday rings, because that level of thickness will help to support any larger or taller settings that you place on top of the ring shank. These are starting points, not commandments. The ring's width, its thickness, whether or not there's going to be a stone setting on top, whether you're going to have a substantial amount of weight or heaviness to the top on a statement ring, all of those things are going to change the answer to the question, what gauge should I use for my ring shank? The goal is not to memorize that a ring should be 12 gauge or 14 gauge. The goal is to realize that you're asking the ring shank to do something very specific in your design, and the metal needs to be able to support what you're asking it to do. Once you start thinking about wear, thickness, support, filing, sanding, finishing, those all become design decisions, and you no longer have to guess at what gauge you should be using for your ring stock. So remember, gauge is the stock measurement. Thickness is the design decisions that you've made, and the ring is ultimately the end result. So now that you have the basics about ring gauge and how to kind of make your decisions, what types of rings would you like me to break down next? A signet ring, a stone set ring, or maybe even a statement ring? Let me know down in the comments, and I'd be happy to make a video for you to help you figure out what questions you need to ask yourself in order to choose the right beginning stock for your design. Until next time, bye.